The main focus of our conversation today is an extraordinary book by Iain McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, published in 2009. And we're thinking especially about its implications for the Christian faith. As well as being a world-renowned psychiatrist, Iain is a literary scholar and a writer who explores themes of creativity and mental illness and the current plight of the humanities. We're excited about the fact that in a month's time, Iain will be here in person in Vancouver when he delivers the 2016 Lang Lectures at Regent College. More about that later. But today he joins us virtually from the wild and wonderful Isle of Skye off the west coast of Scotland. Welcome, Iain. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Ewan. Thank you for having me.
Joining us from Surrey, just up the road here in British Columbia, is Carolyn. Carolyn is a well-known singer-songwriter with 11 albums to her name, and she's the author of a number of acclaimed books, including Theology in Aisle 7, The Uncommon Grace of Everyday Spirituality. She's also the Director of Education for Renovare, an organization that encourages and nurtures spiritual renewal. Hello, Carolyn.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Good to see you. We're also very glad to see Krish Kandaya, the president of the London School of Theology, the largest interdenominational evangelical theological college in Europe, it says here. Krish has wide experience of Christianity in different parts of the world and of the challenges of cross-cultural mission. He's written a number of books, including his most recent that closely relates to our theme for today, Paradoxology, Why Christianity Was Never Meant to Be Simple. And Krish joins us today from Thailand, where it's currently 3 in the morning. So we're incredibly grateful that you're with us, part of the conversation today, Krish. Hope you managed to stay awake.
Oh, I'm sure I will, Ewan. It's a great group of people, and really looking forward to a fruitful conversation.
And we begin with Iain and his book, The Master and His Emissary, and what a massive book it is. Look at that, 500 pages packed with fascinating insights drawn from neuroscience, psychiatry, philosophy, the history of technology, religion, linguistics, literature, the arts. And running right through it is a vivid sense of the complexity and the mystery of human life, the miracle that we are. Iain, your book is packed with paradoxes of one kind or another, but perhaps the most amazing one is this relationship between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. You describe them as providing us with two very opposed understandings of the world, and that there's a kind of power struggle going on between them. Can you give us some kind of explanation what you mean by that?
Yes, well, the first thing to do when one talks about hemispheres is to detoxify. Most people think that they know what and I'm afraid I'm going to ask you to put out of your minds everything you've heard until now, because it's almost all of it complete piffle. For this reason, neuroscience didn't really look at the topic for a long time. They were excited by it back in the 60s and 70s, when there were the first operations which disconnected the two hemispheres. There was a pioneering surgery done to aid people who had intractable epilepsy, and in fact enabled them to lead virtually normal lives. So it was an enormous step forward. But it also opened the door to being able to interrogate each hemisphere one at a time and find out what its views and what its strengths were. And this led to some generalizations that are not right, namely that the left hemisphere is sort of hard-nosed, slightly dull, down-to-earth, reliable, logical and linguistic, and the right hemisphere is pink and fluffy and creative and marvelous and artistic in some sort of way that's entirely nebulous. Well, this is not right, and it's been a bit of an uphill struggle to find out what the difference is, because difference there must be. Think about this. Your brain exists only to make connections. It's a mass of connections. Billions upon billions, more connections, they think, between the neurons than there are indeed particles in the universe. A phenomenal structure of connections, and yet it's completely divided down the middle. Now, why? Nature doesn't do things for a laugh. And it took me about 20 years to work out exactly what this was about. And what it turns out is that it's entirely true that each hemisphere is involved in everything. Both contribute to language, both contribute to reason, to emotion, to creativity, everything. But they do so in a reliably different way. And this has to do with attention. I got to know about this because while the human neuroscience people were rather put off by all the pop psychology and middle management seminars about, re-enabling your right brain and all the rest, these rather humble people kept on observing animals and birds and found that, in fact, that they could see that they use their two hemispheres. You can see this because of the way the eyes are in relation to the hemispheres in many birds and animals. It's a bit more complex in the case of humans, but I won't go into that now. So by these observations, what they realized was that they were solving a survival problem, which is how do you eat and stay alive, which may not sound difficult in Vancouver in 2016, but is actually a problem in the wild. Because on the one hand, you've got to be completely focused on getting your prey or picking out that seed against a background of grit or whatever it is, entirely focused on it. And yet at the same time, if you're not to become someone else's lunch while you're getting your own, you've got to have the exact opposite kind of attention paid to the world at the same time, which is vigilant, open, uncommitted as to what it will find. Now, to begin with, I must admit the penny didn't drop about how amazingly important attention is. But then it became obvious to me, attention is the foundation of our experience. How we attend to something literally changes what we find. And indeed, if you're the object of somebody's attention, you feel yourself change depending on the kind of attention you're subjected to. It can make us feel warm and accepted, or small and mechanical, or whatever. And our views of the world, similarly, recreate the world through attention. So, on the one hand, it is not disputed that there are massive differences between these two hemispheres, because if you have a stroke in the left hemisphere and the same stroke happens in another person in the right hemisphere, they'll have quite different consequences. And everything you can measure about the two hemispheres is quite different. So it's not logical to say, oh, they just do the same thing. But the secret is in this attention. And that means that what they do is they create a whole kind of a world, two different worlds that we're having to balance. And we're not aware of this because we're doing it all the time below the level of consciousness.
So
I
can see the way that this might work in terms of a kind of complementarity, narrow focus, wider vision, context, all of that. But you actually talk about a power struggle going on. I mean, what do you mean by that? This kind of a tension between them?
Yeah, well, I suppose, although ideally they do complement one another, and in reality we have to draw from both, effectively they are creating two kinds of realities, so that when people start doing theology or philosophy or whatever, they have to commit to one or other of these two kinds of reality. And if I could try and sum them up, in the left hemisphere's world there are a lot of little pieces that get put together to make a big picture, and those pieces are individually certain, fixed, static, circumscribed. They're a bit like particles or billiard balls or whatever, and they have simple causal relationships with one another. In the right hemisphere's world, it is quite different. Nothing is actually ultimately separable from anything else. Nothing is fixed and certain. Everything is changing and flowing. So in the one world, you've got a dynamic, evolving, changing, flowing, interconnected world which we are part of and which we affect by our observations. And in the other, a sort of world which is coolly detached from us, in which we can tinker with the little bits and make up a picture of the world. But they're not really of equal value. One is like a map of the world, and the other is more like a real world. And what I think has happened is that there is a conflict going on. And I have to be a bit careful here, because people accuse me of saying, that there's a little man inside each hemisphere that's fighting with the other one. Mind you, I think that the image that they are people is more fruitful than the model that they're just machines, because they are in fact viable on their own as parts of people. But nonetheless, what I'm really saying is, in the same way that that the gene is selfish and it's striving for this and it achieves that at our expense, etc., he's he's conjuring up, scientists are always conjuring up images of some kind of competition, conflict, and strife. And it's not really very different from that. These two hemispheres do different things, and their needs and their values are separate. The right hemisphere wants to understand and to connect, but the left hemisphere has discovered that it's very good at exploiting, at getting, at grabbing, at manipulating. Because that's what it actually exists to do, to catch food, to catch prey, to pick up a seed, to get a twig to build a nest. So it's the one that does all the kind of manipulation of the world, and that makes us powerful. So of course it has a kind of superficial attraction. If you latch onto this point of view, you start to be technologically powerful. But at the same time, if you ignore what the right hemisphere is telling you about how we are connected to everything else in the world, we end up turning the beautiful, amazing, awe-inspiring universe in which we're part into a heap of rubbish through our efforts.
And this is the significance then of the title of your book, is it? This power struggle and this imbalance in the relationship between the right and left hemisphere, the Master and His Emissary.
That's right. I mean, this has changed over time, and in the second half of the book, I looked through the history of the West from the ancient Greeks onwards, looking at periods when the two types of knowing seem to work rather well together. But my thesis is that latterly, certainly in the last 150 years, since the Enlightenment and even more since the Industrial Revolution, we've got locked into a very reduced, mechanistic version of the world, which rules out many things. I mean, fortunately, most of us know deep down that this can't be right, because we go to an opera or we see a very beautiful scene, and it's not reducible to all the garbage, you know, it's to do with sexual selection or whatever. Not at all. It's obviously we have a love for certain things, goodness, beauty, and truth in themselves. And so we know that that's not right, but unfortunately the culture has a rhetoric which drives us ever more into this, I would say, very reductionist model of the world.
Now, when it comes to the arts and everything, you spend a lot of time in the book exploring the arts and the role that they play, and the role that metaphor plays in language. Why is that so important to you? Why is it? Is this almost like almost like a test case of what's happening to us?
Well, again, it was a bit, as with attention, it was a bit like a revelation, quite how important metaphor is. Because, of course, we're used to thinking of it from the left hemisphere's point of view as just a dispensable adornment that actually probably gets in the way of the truth. But in fact, of course, it's the way in which we contact reality. Language could easily become a self-referring system of signs. In fact, there are movements in the humanities these days which project language as a self-referring system of signs. But if we're to break out of that to the actual embodied experience we have in the world, we need to get back to embodied experience. And a metaphor, the word literally means something that carries you across the gulf between that abstract, virtual, inside the head world of symbols and the reality out there. And if we use literalistic, simple language, we're always taken back to everyday meanings and everyday experience. But if we want to contact the things that we intuit, that are beyond that, the things we know through the arts, through religion, through music, things that we used to be, you know, richly, abundantly aware of in ancient cultures, but we've now lost, metaphor is the route back. And so if you abolish metaphor, you impoverish the way we understand. And one of the things that has really grieved me, I don't want to rush on to religion, but I hope to get a lot of backs up with people now, but I really despair of what we've done to the liturgy and to the whole business, this wonderful transcendental worship that we used to have, and exists now in the Christian faith practically only in the Orthodox Church.
So you
which I find
see Christianity in particular as being sort of complicit in this move, do you, of the triumph of the left hemisphere?
Well, it has become so, I'm afraid, in the last few hundred years. It's cooked its own goose. It used to be, certainly up until the Middle Ages, and from the early Desert Fathers onwards, a huge resource for mystical understanding, which is often paradoxical in nature and has been chucked out therefore as not making any sense since the Reformation. But if you have a literalistic movement, which the Reformation essentially was, let's get back to literal words, to literal meanings, dispense with ritual, dispense with music, dispense with poetic meaning, well, frankly, you've cut the plank from under your foot. I mean, you have nothing left with which to contact the transcendent.
Okay, so at this point, Iain, I want to bring in some religious types to get their thoughts on what you're saying. But Carolyn, first of all, what's your reaction to Iain's analysis? I mean, what do you make of the what's offered here?
Well, I think it's fascinating, and I think the thing that struck me the hardest when I read Iain's book was what it showed me about epistemology, about figuring out what it is that we can actually know. So most Western epistemological systems will kind of give lip service to the idea that there's different ways of knowing, different kinds of knowledge. So they'll say, yeah, there's propositional knowledge. I know that 2 + 2 = 4. But there's also acquaintance knowledge, direct knowledge, experiential knowledge, the way I know my husband or my kids or my dog. There's this experiential knowledge. But most Western systems, they'll acknowledge those 2 different kinds of knowing, but we kind of have privileged the propositional knowledge. So we've said the things that we can really count on as being solid ways of knowing things, they fall in this propositional know that knowledge. And it's really striking. Iain unpacks this in his book. In English, we just have the word know, to know, whereas in other languages, we actually have 2 different words for these 2 different kinds of knowledge. So in German, we have Wissen for propositional knowledge and Kennen for that relationship experiential knowledge. In French, we have savoir and connaître. In Latin, we have sapere and cognoscere. Cognoscere is to intimately know something, to experience something, and sapere is to have a propositional, abstract understanding of something. And that has become hugely important to me as someone who was raised in a Christian, an evangelical Christian tradition, very firmly in modernism, where it was really, really important for us to take things that we knew to be true and be able to nail them down propositionally. So we had a very strong emphasis on apologetics, which was right and good. But we really privileged this idea that only that which we could kind of explain in propositional statements was really real.
So Iain actually kind of really drives his critique of Christianity's complicity in all this. He drives it home, particularly with respect to the tradition I know that you're in and I'm in which is the Protestant tradition, and particularly kind of Puritanism, which he sees as kind of really being sort of eroding this emphasis on the mystery and metaphor and so on. Do you buy that? Do you think that that's the problem in our tradition?
I think it has been. I think it's fluid. I think it's changing. But I think, for sure, what I was going to say is that sometimes I would have this problem where there would be this way of knowing. We've all had that experience, like Iain was talking about at the opera, where you encounter something beautiful and it's telling you something that you can't put into words. Or you have a spiritual experience, you have an encounter that you believe is with the living God. But for me, I think in my tradition there was this rush to put that into words, and to resist pluralism, to resist too many options of meaning, to kind of get the meaning nailed down. So I think Iain just called it literalism. Yeah, I think the tradition of which I am a part has been complicit in this sort of urge to reduce everything that it's possible to know into only that which we can articulate, which is to really flatten out the world. And what we have said for several decades now in our tradition is we have to watch that we don't put God in a box, and that we have been complicit in doing that sometimes.
Krish, what's your take on this? Do you actually buy the analysis here that Iain has offered?
I found the book really stimulating, and it's so huge in its scope. So there is a lot of physiology, anatomy, but there's philosophy, critique of culture, it's massive, and I find it a really helpful new lens to bring to lots of different conversations, whether that's internal to the Christian faith, have we preferenced the left side, the left hemisphere, and missed out this kind of bigger picture, metaphorical understanding of God. I think there's a lot of evidence that we have done that. You look at the way over the years we tried to make Christianity sound more scientific, because science was where the real truth was, in a kind of empirical sense, and so we started to talk about the science of theology, or the 4 spiritual laws, and that was where truth really resided. Or if you listen to a lot of the preaching, particularly within the Protestant tradition, we preference Paul's letters because that was where real truth, propositional truth, was presented, rather than the Gospels or the Old Testament narratives. And we forced those New Testament documents into a mold that they weren't built for. So they were part of a bigger narrative. And Paul isn't trying to summarize all the teaching of the church forever. He was trying to write some really important time-bound, contextual, narrative moments into the church's life. So I think that has happened. And you could probably track that across, it was a reaction to that overemphasis on the left hemisphere, why we saw a movement towards the kind of charismatic and Pentecostal renewal, because we'd missed out that numinous quality that maybe Carolyn was talking about. So I think I do buy a lot of that.
And so your book Paradoxology, and all about sort of us making faith too simple. I mean, is this basically the same argument, essentially?
Yes, it is. I'm trying to look at some of the bits of the Bible that we've kind of avoided because they make life difficult for that kind of 4-point gospel. We've lost a lot of confidence in the gospel because we've oversimplified it. We don't even believe it's that simple anymore, so will I commend it to somebody else? And so I went back to some of the hardest stories in Scripture. So, why would God ask Abraham to sacrifice his own son? That doesn't compute. Why would God, through the Exodus narrative, call his people to be with him and yet ban them from his presence? That's the whole paradox that's going, isn't it? That there is a God who wants us close to him, but his holiness means that we can't be close to him. Or what do you do about the Joshua narrative, where a God that is full of compassion and abounding in mercy still seems to ask his nation to bring a genocidal quality to their reaction to the Canaanites? So you've got these kind of tensions going on, and I think Carolyn put it really well. We're trying to fit God into a box rather than release him to be all that he is. And the classic line is, of course, from C.S. Lewis in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, when the children have come into Narnia for the first time, and they're in the beaver's house, and they're asking, they've heard about Aslan, and they're saying, well, is he safe? And in one sense, we've tried to domesticate God so he fits within our kind of categories. And the beaver's response is fantastic, isn't it? Because, of course, God isn't safe, but he is good. And I think what Iain has brought us is a wonderful way of reimagining and I suppose, examining our own biases. One little thing that helped me as I read it was to think of the movie Inside Out. I don't know if you've seen that one, where you've got these different parts of your personality all fighting over the controls of the spaceship that is you. And I really thought that was a nice way of viewing what Iain was bringing as the left and the right. Actually, when things are working best, it's both together, not either or.
So, I mean, if this is right, I mean, both of you. Sorry, Iain, carry on.
Yeah. Because I mean, this is so rich what you're saying, and just on what you mentioned, I'm giving the annual Blake Society lecture in London when I just before I come out to you, and I've been looking at Blake's tiger and pondering very much on his notion that God is this very good and loving being, but also there is an awe-inspiring aspect that we don't understand, but that, together with what both of you said, set up a number of things in my mind. One was we've tried to make religion too scientific, and in a way I sort of agree. And we've tried to make religion too propositional, and in a way I agree. But what I'm going to be trying to say in my Lang lectures is that true science and true religion actually come together, that they're not at war with one another at all. The left hemisphere in religion and the left hemisphere in science that are the enemy of bringing them together, because they stand there going, well, your sense doesn't make any sense to me, and both sides appear to be getting nowhere. Whereas really what I'm going to be saying is that the more deep you go into science, the more you realize that we don't know, that what we know are models of things that we search to understand, that have paradoxical qualities and are extraordinary in keeping with the things I want to bring out from the apophatic tradition in theology. That's the tradition in which you reject the idea that it's easy to grasp what God is, but instead have to say, to sort of try and clear away the misunderstandings around God and let shine forth. I know you know that, but I'm saying that.
Yeah, I find that really helpful, and this another way I've kind of tried to put it together in my head as I've read your book is the idea of binocular vision. You know, your vision is stronger because you've got two eyes that are slightly bringing a different perspective, and too often this reaction that we get, you know, we've been too propositional, and so sometimes the church says, well, we're not going to do proposition anymore at all. You know, we can't say anything about God. God is beyond our knowing, and we ignore, you know, what is really clear about Scripture and creedal Christianity. But equally, that fear, the other side, is to say, well, you know, we don't really know what to do with metaphor. We want to pin it all down. You know, these are postmodern times, and we want to hold on to truth. And, you know, we're not going to leave enough room for experience because that's dangerous. And so we polarize in an unhelpful way. But bringing those both together gives us the fuller, richer, rounder picture.
I think far more people these days are driven away from religion because without any sort of ability to get into the sort of arena where they might understand what is being said. So from the outside, they're presented with a lot of completely ridiculous propositions, and they're told, you'd better believe these things. And of course they say, well, of course I don't believe them, and they walk away. I mean, later, much, much later, they might come to understand the paradoxical meaning of those things. But to try and get people to assent to propositions at that stage is wrong. I'm not saying that propositions don't have a place, but you know, the origin of the word credo is cordo. It actually goes further back into Sanskrit, as you probably know. It means about placing your heart in a certain place. It's not about, it's about a relationship. It's about what I call a disposition, not about a proposition. It's about having a disposition towards the world, in which God then has a place and may or may not disclose himself.
Carolyn, if I could bring Carolyn here. One of the things that Iain says, particularly about Puritanism, is that there's a fear of the power of the imagination, and you know, Puritanism has been very important in our heritage, isn't it? An evangelical heritage, and yet can one recognise that? I mean, how do you deal with that? Because it's there, isn't it?
The fear of the imagination.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think again it's the push to the plain meaning has been at the heart of a lot of this, and this and what we have to start to understand here, and here's where art can help us so much, and I think the church is rediscovering this. I think there are signs of hope all over the place. But the beautiful thing about art, because all art kind of works metaphorically, is art hints at the irreducibility of the world, the inexhaustibility of the world, and I think that the church, when the church has seen that, so Jeremy Begbie, he gives the example of the metaphor in Shakespeare, Juliet is the sun. Right? Juliet is the sun. It says all these things because it's working metaphorically. And if we tried to flatten it down into a pure propositional statement, we'd have to pick one thing that it means. So Juliet's hot, or my world revolves around Juliet, or whatever. Right? But if we let it just stay as the metaphor, there's this richness of meaning, this multiplicity of meaning. Now the church has been afraid, I think, that means that it can mean whatever you want. or that it doesn't mean anything. That's not true. It means some very particular things. It's just that those things are inexhaustible and irreducible. So the church needs to reconnect with imagination as a way of leading us into what my friend Chris Hall calls the dimensional mystery of God, that however much you know, there's always going to be more. There's this invitation to go deeper and deeper and deeper, and imagination and the arts aren't a threat to that. They're a gift to that if handled properly. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, fascinating, and you're so right. One of the things about the left hemisphere is that it likes black and white. It likes certainty, and it's either this or it's that. And it also, of course, is the one that, if you like, its disposition is one of control. It doesn't like uncertainty, because then it means things are out of control. And I think, if I be very do a sort of soundbite about Puritanism, it's frightened of the power of the body, the power of emotion, and the power of imagination, rightly, because we can get swept away by fantasy, which is not the same as imagination. We haven't got time to go into that, but they're very, very different ideas. We can be swept away by emotions that can deceive us and carry us to outrageous acts, and we want to avoid that. And the body, we can get enmeshed in things with the body that can take us to places we don't want to go. So they're right in a way to be cautious, but they're wrong to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the answer is not really so much a kind of, oh, well, let's have a compromise. It's not like a middle point on the line that's all sort of, it's not something very vital, which is that you have to see it almost at right angles to any of these ideas. There's a kind of embracing of the body. For example, by Lucretianism, which was about pleasure, was a rather ascetic cult. It was not about orgies and banquets. It was about actually leading a very simple life, rather like a monk's life, with simple diet and regular habits, but embodied and being part of the world. Very important. Again, emotion, I give my heart, is important. You need to know where you're giving and who you're giving.
Yeah, we've got a question here from one of our viewers, and it's from Lucilla in Costa Rica, and she's actually it kind of relates to something what you've just said, actually, about your kind of retractions maybe, or your kind of qualifications about your criticism of Puritanism. But she said she thinks you're too hard on the left hemisphere, and particularly on the Reformation and on the Enlightenment. And because, I mean, actually these things have brought incredible benefits, particularly on issues like justice, you know, and rights for kind of individual things. And it's all well and good talking about kind of right hemisphere big principle stuff, but actually you need to get down to the nitty-gritty sometimes and actually assert justice issues, and that comes via laws and specific things. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I would say absolutely, and I don't disagree at all. I mean, one of the troubles is that even in 600 pages, I was very compressed in what I tried to say. And in a few minutes now, I don't have the time. I mean, obviously, the Enlightenment was an incredibly important movement in the history of ideas, one of which we're all the beneficiaries, and which in many ways I'm deeply, deeply fond of its best productions. And the Reformation was very necessary in the context of a corrupt church and all the abuses we know about. I mean, of course, I take all that for granted, but what I'm really saying is I'm trying to pitch another point of view, which is not so often heard, because we see all that these days. We're children of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment's gone mad in our time, so the only thing we care about are things that can be legislated about and written down in books of rights and so forth, and we really need to get back to a much more humane, something in which imagination, reason, and emotion all in a very tempered way work together, a kind of wisdom, which is certainly not in rationalism. So rationalism is a small part of reason. Rationalism and reason are not the same thing, and reason also needs to be put together with experience and so on to produce wisdom. And what I'm really saying is, yes, the Reformation and the Enlightenment were good impulses, but they also got carried away. They became very extreme. They became very black and white. They resulted in the burning of churches and the burning of people. And they resulted in our time in Richard Dawkins' rubbishing everything to do with religion. So we've got to, yes, accept that these impulses are good and they need to be balanced. But the binocular vision, really, that Krish was talking about, but we're a long way from it.
Yeah, I mean, where do you place yourself in all of this? I mean, you know, obviously there's a lot about religion in the book. It's not a religious book. It's not a theological book. But I mean, how did you come to this analysis, and where do you place in it yourself in it as far as your kind of understanding of religion is concerned?
Well, in answer to your how do I come to the answer is by living. And I, although the book is crypto-theological, I don't actually mention the word God anywhere in the book. I don't think, because in a way I wanted to lead people to ideas without frightening them. And if I start talking about God, they'll immediately switch off. But if I say, look, come over here and look at how the view changes, then they might go, ooh, you've got a point of view. So that's how I came at it. I mean, all my life I've had various, I come from a completely non-religious background. Neither of my parents had any truck with religion at all. As I was growing up, I wasn't subject to any pressures, but I started to think various things. I started to think the sum of the parts is not the same as the whole. I started to think, you know, the world is not an inert mechanism. It actually is a responsive organism. I started to think, you know, that the abstract world in which we lived lacked something, and that individual concrete things were also beautiful and an important aim of creation. And that set me off on a path which was essentially theological. And when I left school, I was in fact going to join a monastery. But best for everybody that I didn't.
We're on Sky now. Krish, I mean, one of the themes that emerged there is this emphasis on embodiment and a connection with, you know, our experience of the world being really very much connected, even our knowledge of the world, it's all connected with our bodies and all of that. Do you think we've got a particular problem in the Christian faith with our relationship to our bodies? I mean, how do you see that?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about binocular vision that Ian's been bringing us, and I'd love to bring a kind of third dialogue partner into that conversation. All the work that Jamie Smith's been doing recently about liturgy and the way that habits form our engagement with the world, I think that's another fascinating element to bring into it, and it's often neglected. So I teach a course periodically at Regent around holistic disciple making, and I kind of divide out the different tribes of how we kind of normally handle this. So for the head tribe, we like to kind of induct people in doctrine, and we give them the creeds, and we teach them how to defend their faith. For the heart tribe, we like to help people experience God through worship, and you know, you expect transformation of character through a kind of zapping of God at the end of a meeting in a ministry time. And for the final tribe, I guess you've got the kind of muscle tribe, the activist tribe, and they've kind of understood that virtue comes through practice, and, you know, continuing to, you know, walk in the ways of God. And so I think that would be the third element maybe to bring into this conversation that we've brought. You know, what does our reality is constructed not just by these two hemispheres that we use to view and engage with the world, but it is actually our daily practice. One little example of that, so the reason I'm in Thailand is I'm at a conference where 500 leaders from around the world are gathering to talk about how we can help vulnerable children in different parts of the world. And you know, I've been trying to help my kids to grow in their discipleship by teaching them the Bible, you know, reading the Bible at bedtimes, or, you know, it's Lent, and so we're doing Bible verses and all that kind of stuff. We want them to experience God, and so we do that through prayer and, you know, going to events and seeing beauty. But actually, we're a fostering family, and as we foster children, we're embodying the gospel. We're kind of showing the compassion and grace of God, and that is transforming in itself as well. So I think that third element maybe is just the other lens we could bring into this conversation.
Carolyn, your take on this theme of embodiment. I mean, you know, do we have a particular problem here, or is this something that we actually know? We should know about it because we have you know, a doctrine of the incarnation, don't we? The Word becoming flesh. Yeah. But Is that a particular problem for us, Caroline?
Yeah, I think we've recognized historically there's a certain squeamishness about the body. This idea that we can somehow be more spiritual than our bodies, and there's these huge parallels to the case that Iain is making about these two hemispheres, because we have a transcendent God and we have an incarnated, embodied God. And so yeah, there's been a lot of conversation, I think, in Christian circles about getting past our funniness, about our bodiliness, and about there was some ways of thinking in the last 100 years in the Christian church that disregarded creation, disregarded the world around us, because we thought maybe God was just going to torch it and start again at some point. There were some funny ideas about that, but they're not really Christian ideas, because yes, in Christianity the pivot point of this story is a God who takes on flesh and walks among us. He's very particular. He's very embodied, and so hopefully there's a recovery going on where we start to recognize the created world as very, very important. And then I love what Chris said about it's in our bodies that we form our characters and attend to the world. And so Dallas Willard, a guy that I love that writes a lot about Christian spiritual formation, he argues that the body is right at the center of spiritual formation, because it's who we are. It's how we engage with the world. So hopefully we're recovering our physicality.
We've got
I think in every religion the body has played a very important part, and does in worship. I mean, I would say ritual is embodied metaphor. And I think it's very important. Nice. And most cultures, it's very important when you're praying or meditating to adopt a certain physical posture. You can't separate the soul and the body in this way. This problem started with Plato and got worse since Descartes. It's about the denigration of the body. And what's so wonderful about the Christian story is that God actually came down to be in the flesh and took the flesh back up into heaven with the resurrection of the body. So I think these are both very, very moving ideas. And just to say to Krish, it doesn't need to be a third element, actually, because it's implicit in what the right hemisphere does. The right hemisphere is embodied in its thinking, in its practice, in its everything. And it literally is more connected with the body. In neurophysiological terms, it's better in touch with the body and has a better representation of what's going on in the body. But it also connects to the idea, as you say, of how you tread a path of belief, because I was very troubled as a child by Pascal's wager. That it logically makes sense that you should believe in God, because if there is a God, phew. But if there isn't a God, you've done no harm. And I was thinking, well, first of all, there's a bit of a problem here, which is, but if you just don't believe, you just don't believe. But that's because we think of belief again as propositional. But if you think of it as dispositional, you come back to what Pascal taught, which was that you first adopt the manner, the habits, the way of life of what you wish to believe and be. Yeah. So I'm entirely on side with that. It doesn't require a third hemisphere, I promise.
Iain, can I just ask you a quick question, just here before we lose this moment? Okay. I really enjoyed your discussion about the brain-mind debate, and where obviously it's an ongoing conversation within philosophy and within psychiatry, I suppose. Do you think your conclusions about the brain-mind debate also shed light on the body-soul conversation as well?
Absolutely. Well, I would see them as different aspects of the same problem. The brain is certainly a part of our body, and mental life isn't just cognitive. It is many other things. And I gave a talk about the soul at the RSA in London, which is on YouTube for those who are interested, in which I got a certain amount of flack for saying, well, it's clearly not this and it's not that. But what I was really saying is more that the words we would like to substitute for soul will never do the job. You can't substitute heart or mind or anything else. We need that idea of the soul. And our souls and our bodies are intimately connected. They're two aspects of the same thing. They may even be the same thing viewed through different lenses, although I believe that it's not necessary to have a body for the soul to persist.
We've got a question here, Iain, that kind of relates to the subtitle of your book. I mean, it's the divided brain and the making of the Western world is the subtitle. But Steve in Vancouver has asked about this. He says that you talk about the relationship between Eastern and Western metaphysics, epistemology, and cognition. Where does this play out as far as kind of other cultures are concerned? Obviously in Vancouver, we're in the midst of, particularly, I mean, there's a huge population from China and Asia here. How does this feed into the kind of relationship between Western culture and Eastern culture, or is this now just a kind of global mishmash?
No, I think that's a beautiful question, and absolutely right. And you'll find I do deal briefly with Oriental culture at the end of the book. But people have said to me, how come you only wrote about Western history? And I've got three answers to that, which is one, I don't know enough about Oriental cultures to pontificate about them. Secondly, I was running out of space. And thirdly, the problem is largely ours, because in the East, there hasn't been, until very recently, this problem. But in the last 100 years, it has, with the importation of Marxist ideology in China. The Chinese, who have an ancient and fantastic history of, indeed, paradoxical wisdom, which I believe is profound as anything human can get, they've thrown this away and embraced now Western capitalism, and I feel very sorry about that. Because we need to just learn from them, from the ancient Chinese, Indian, Japanese, and so on traditions, but instead they are aping our folly just as we're about to walk into the abyss. That's really, really sad.
Chris, how do you think this plays out in other parts of the world? I mean, you've got a big experience of kind of global Christianity. How is this affecting the church globally, do you think?
I'm fascinated by this, and I guess one of the conversations I'd love to have if we get time is that I don't think even in Western culture we can speak about a monoculture anymore. So, black culture in America is very different to white middle class culture, and even walking across a university campus in the science department, you get a different mode of thinking that's going on in the arts department, and so I still buy the overall thesis, but I think it's probably, and you've got to spell these things out in order to be able to make them clear, but I still think we've got a more of a mismatch even in Western culture. But on a global scale, I think one of the dangers is if the Western church has bought into the left hemisphere dominance, we're now exporting that in our Christian marketplace to the rest of the world. So as I travel around, sadly, we're often singing the same songs, so songs that were created in the West, we now export to the world. And we've been doing that for generations, not just recently with wonderful, Christian songwriters like Matt Redmond or Tim Hughes. We were doing that with Isaac Watts and Charles Wesley. But similarly, our theology is being exported too. So go into the bookshop of an average Christian evangelical church, you will find the same Western authors. In fact, one group has said there is a global theological famine, and what the world needs is more of our Western theologians translated into their languages. And I think, again, that leaves us partially blind, and that we need more of a global conversation. We need to be hearing from our brothers and sisters around the world, allowing their different wiring to kind of shape our perception, and we'll have a richer, broader, deeper grasp of God if there is that kind of cross-cultural dialogue going on.
Carolyn, do you think there's been a kind of Carolyn, do you think there's been a kind of homogenization? You're a musician. I mean, particularly in Christian music, there's been a huge restriction of the range of stuff that we even do in churches anymore. I mean, is that part of this conversation, do you think?
I think it is, and I think there's to veer slightly where you're leading me. There's long been critique of contemporary Christian art, and a lot of groaning about contemporary Christian art. And the more that I've engaged with the ideas in this book, the more I've thought, well, maybe part of the problem is, if I can go back to those words for kinds of knowing again, art kind of thrives when it's canon, when it's experience, when it's metaphor. And sometimes as those of us who are Christians who do art, we felt like we need to make the canon into Wissen, and then it's just not art anymore. It's something else. And so yeah, to hear Chris say, not only have we done that, but we're exporting it to places that might actually be able to give us more of a right brain way of approaching the faith. That's a problem. But we do live in a very we have a lot more access to other cultures than we've ever had before, and that's really promising if we can give everybody a voice at the party in terms of how they approach these things. And I also think there's some generational things going on here. If I can just say quickly, I taught a little bit of these ideas to some Bible college students last year, and I asked them what the implications were for these two kinds of knowing for their worship services. And I expected them, based on my experience of the evangelical church, to say, yeah, we need to create more space in our worship together for this kind of experiential knowledge of God. And what some of them said was, oh, we're totally after the experiential knowledge of God, and we don't know anything anymore about more sort of articulated, guiding kind of ideas about, we're all into the mystery, and we've kind of given up on the revelation. And so there may be some flips that are taking place, some over corrections. And sometimes they say about the Bible that it can disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed. Like it has that power to provide the corrective. And I kind of think the Bible, will Wissen the overly Kennened and Kennen the overly Wissened, depending on where you're coming from, because it will say, come, let us reason together. Yeah. Wissen, and it will also say, be still and know that I am God. And that in the Latin Vulgate, that know that I am God is cognoscere. It's the Latin verb for experience. So there needs to be some coming together of these two worlds.
Carolyn, I totally agree that Scripture is the key here, because the range of genre, for example, in Scripture gives us opportunity to tap into these various different balances. So the Proverbs are yes, they're very clearly propositional, and yet they're not. They're kind of mysterious and paradoxical. Or the Psalms, the beauty and the richness of the metaphorical language. So I think a closer attention to Scripture and all of it, and a willingness to let Scripture take the lead rather than pressing Scripture into a left brain kind of cookie cutter, and allowing the Psalms to be preached differently or experienced differently than a Pauline epistle. I think that could be a really powerful way we could auto-correct. But I do think if we do that in global dialogue, that will be even richer.
Yeah.
Iain, you want to come in there, or are you?
Yeah. Well, I come from a different point of view, and I don't share the view that the Bible is the key thing here. But then, of course, I have to be very frank. I'm not comfortable with the idea that Christianity is the only path to God. Not at all. I think my heart tells me, my experience tells me that there are many, many ways of coming to God, and it's not for us to judge. And I know that sort of sounds a bit feeble and fluffy, and but I think we've got to, as far as I'm concerned, I can't be shifted from that position. Yeah. When we talk about sort of the empire of the Western way of thinking being exported and so on, I mean, that's just the left hemisphere is an empire builder. It's about power, and we are exporting our vision and crowding out the other voices. And I know that people have said, oh, well, we have a multicultural now, and I know exactly what you mean, and that's true. But we could get overcomforted by that, because how deep is that multiculture? It means, yes, there's wonderful different restaurants and, people, different foods, and people, but seriously, the culture we live in, the mind-forged manacles of the way government thinks, the way big business thinks, the way that the public voices think, and they all think these days with this very left hemisphere take, I feel. And when I talk people, the response I get, and this is where I think hope comes from, where I think I would agree with Carolyn that young people, it's a generational thing. Well, actually, it isn't generational because it's people of every age. But, you know, when I speak, my normal experience is to have people just come up to me and say, thank God somebody is saying this, you know, because I know it's true. Yeah. And you've given me words to say it. And you know, so it's not that people don't know these things, it's that they feel frightened because they don't know how to articulate them, and that's because they are bloody difficult things to articulate. You know, it's rather like if you work in an organization, the really important things can't be measured. So what do? They measure the unimportant things and put them in the place, and then say, oh, you haven't met these things. No, we were too busy doing what we should be doing. And the same thing goes, if you have to articulate, you articulate the things that can be articulated. But they're wrong, because the things that really matter, I won't say they can't be articulated, but they can only be articulated within a broad context, which is the one I try to put it.
We've got a question here from one of our viewers. This is Bill in Crofton, BC. Don't know where that is, but I mean, he likes your analysis, Iain, and he says, but given the nature of paradox, what, if anything, can one practice as an individual, as a family, as a community to rekindle a mind-brain balance more like our predecessors? So, I mean, how do you know, if we're out of kilter, if we're out of balance, how do we get it back? What, you know, Iain? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't think there's any you know, 5 things to do which we can all go away and do. But I think one of the things, I'm a psychiatrist, and I know that if you want people to change, it's no good telling them, do this, do that, do the other, because they won't see why and they won't do it. But you bring them, the whole business in psychiatry is bringing to the point where they say, what I need to do is X, which is what you knew all along they needed to see. Now, what I think I do is to try to open people's minds, and from the emails that I get from people, they do see something. Now, they will each take it away and put it into practice in their lives. It might be that where you work, you start questioning some of the rules and the assumptions, and that in your life you start being less rigid about the kind of present-day ways of thinking. Try inverting them. I've said, for example, that, or will say in a book I'm writing now, that every government should fund a ministry of inverse policy, which says, okay, what would happen if we did precisely the opposite of all the things we're recommending? And we would then see what the disadvantages of all the things we're doing are. Now, you should practice every day taking 3 things you think are definitely right that you should be doing, and then turn them on their heads and see how there could be benefit out of thinking differently. Because it's really about freeing up your bloody mindset. That's what it's about. It's not me prescribing things for you to do. It's about you going away and freeing up your mindset. And the way to do that is constantly invert the things you think you know.
Okay. Okay. Carolyn, is this your approach to Renovari, what you're doing in Renovari? Upsetting the mindset?
I think in a way, I mean, there's a couple of things. I think Renovari is a lot about spiritual formation. Some of the things Krish was talking about in terms of cultivating habits of receptivity, which I think will really help the right brain kind of get back to its place, its proper place. So just quickly, for example, we have a 2-year Institute of Spiritual Formation, and the people that designed it have been really intentional about saying, okay, this train runs down a set of train tracks, one rail of which is sort of cognitive ways of thinking about the stuff we're talking about, and the other way is praxis. And so we put a lot of emphasis on reading and learning, but a lot of emphasis on things like Ignatian meditation or Lectio Divina, or just getting quiet and open, and so just trying to create that space again. And there's a wonderful thing from Ronald Rolheiser, who's a Catholic, about this fish who goes to his mom and says, "Mom, what is water? I keep hearing about water. What is water?" And of course he's swimming around in the water, and that might not be unlike our predicament if we believe what Acts says, that in God we live and move and have our being, but we don't see it, right? So the mom says there's a couple ways the mom can approach this. She takes him down to the bottom of the ocean, because this is a parable, so that can happen. So she takes him down to the bottom of the ocean, sets up a slide projector, and shows him pictures of water, pictures of land, says, "This is water, this is land, you're in water." And he goes, "Oh, okay, great, I'm starting to get it." And then she says, "Now I just want you to sit and let the water flow through you." and that's this openness and this receptivity that I think for those of us that are interested in religious education or just even our own spiritual practice, we've got to have both sides of that coin and be in that position of openness.
Great. Krish, what would you kind of leave us with in terms of a kind of response on this, a kind of practical response on this issue?
I would say there are three things that maybe you could attend to as a believer. The first is Scripture. I'm still convinced that that the sweep of Scripture holds in tension these beautiful different dimensions of left and right brain with the different styles and genres. So the whole of Scripture, and don't let Paul's epistles be the only part of the Bible that you explore. Expose yourself to the riches of all that's there.
Two more.
The second is
got to push you on. Sorry, the other two are.
The second one is have friends from different backgrounds, whether that's different spiritual tribes or different parts of the world. That's another way that you'll be forced to think outside of your normal box. And I think finally it's the work of the Spirit. We want to be available to the Holy Spirit. He's renewing our minds. He's helping us to drawing us into truth, but also drawing us into a richer experience of God himself.
Great. Well, we're going to have to end our conversation there. I'm very sorry. Thanks so much to Iain for writing this book and for giving us so much to think about and continuing to think about. We very much look forward to your long lectures, Iain. Thank you to our panelists, all of them, Carolyn as well, and Carolyn Ahrens and Krish Kandaya, for offering your insights on paradox and truth and authentic faith. And thanks to you, our audience, for those who contributed questions, those who haven't. Sorry if we didn't get to all of them. If you want to direct any of your lingering questions to our panelists, then send them through regentredux.net. In a few hours, we're going to put this up on the net, this session. It'll be on the Redux webpage. So if it's been helpful to you, please be sure to share it with friends. And we're going to add some more resources on paradox from both Regent College and Christianity Today. As I mentioned earlier, we're very excited that Iain is coming to Regent in person to deliver these long lectures, and it's going to happen on March the 9th and the 10th, 2016. So if you found this conversation stimulating and provocative, you can join us here at Regent in a month's time to hear more. The details about the long lectures can be found on the Redux website. Our next edition of Redux will take place in May 2016. If you're not already on our mailing list, you can sign up at regentredux.net. You'll be the first to know about the next topic and the panelists who are going to be on board. And if you have suggestions for future Redux topics, then send them through the Ask a Question via email section of the Redux website. Thanks again to everyone. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.